Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial. So today what I'm going to be showing you is how you can go full screen in the browser using JavaScript using the Fullscreen API. So I'll be showing you how you can do this for an element on the page, or as I'm doing here, for the entire page, and how you can toggle between full screen view and the normal view. Okay, so here in JavaScript, I'm going to be showing you how you can use the Fullscreen API. I've already selected the button that you just saw on screen that has an ID of toggler, and also the element containing the text, which has an ID of post. So I'll be making that full screen after I've showed you an example of making the full page full screen. So to make a part of your HTML go full screen, you call the request full screen method on it. So if you want your entire document to go full screen, you call request full screen on document element. So this is selecting the entire HTML document, so HTML tags and everything between them. Now, if you call request full screen immediately like this, not in response to any kind of event, then it won't work. So we're getting an error here telling us that the permissions check failed. And the reason is that to prevent misuse, the browser won't let you go full screen until the user has interacted with the page. So for this reason, request full screen, it doesn't work if you call it immediately, but it will work if you call it in response to an event that is generated by a user interacting with the page, like a click event. So if I click on the button on the page now, this will call request full screen on the entire document element. As you can see, this has worked. We've gone full screen for the entire document. Okay, now let's talk about toggling between the full screen view and the normal view. So by default, a user can exit full screen mode at any time by pressing the escape key, but let's program it so that a user can switch between the two views entirely using the button. Okay, so now in response to the button being clicked, I want to check whether we are in full screen mode and making my response conditional upon that. So you can do that by checking if there is an existing full screen element. If there is, then we are in full screen mode. So in this case, I want to exit full screen, and you can do that by calling the exit full screen function on the document. You don't need to call it on the particular element that is currently in full screen view. Just call it on document and it will exit from that view. Otherwise, if there is no current full screen element, then the else block is going to run, requesting full screen on the entire page, in this example, like we were before. So now the button should toggle us between the normal view and the full screen view. So that is working. You'd also want to change the text here. So you might think of changing the text after the call to go into full screen mode or out of full screen mode. So if you're exiting full screen mode, then you'd want the button back into full screen mode. Then the next click on the button would be to go into full screen mode. And if you are going into full screen mode, then the next click would be to exit. So this works kind of okay, but what happens if the user clicks escape to get out of full screen mode? Then the text doesn't change because there wasn't a click on the button to change the text. So if I'm using the escape key, the click event is never firing, and so none of this logic is being run. So you can prevent this by changing the text in response to an event that you can listen out for on document called full screen change. So this event occurs every time there is a switch between the normal view and the full screen view, no matter how it occurs. So it doesn't have to be via the button. And in here, you want to check whether in response to the event, if there is a full screen element. So if there is one, then you want to change the text of the button to exit full screen. If there isn't a full screen element, then you want to change text to go full screen, and then we don't need the text inside of this if else here, because we're now changing the text in response to the event. So let's test this now. If I press escape, okay, so now I'll show you how you can switch between the normal and full screen view for a specific element in the DOM. So let's do that for the post element that contains the text. So to do that, just call request full screen on that element, but this can lead to unexpected results. So the issue here is that the text color and background styling was coming from the body element, but the post element is no longer embedded inside the body. So to fix this, you can add a CSS class in response to the full screen change event. So when you go full screen, you want to add the class to the post element in this case. So I'll call this is full screen. So this is now going to apply to the post in full screen, and when exiting full screen, it's no longer going to apply. So in CSS, I've already created the isFullScreen class. I'll just uncomment it here. So when I go full screen now, this styling should apply to the post element because the isFullScreen class is being added to its class list, and it's being removed when we're switching out of full screen. So let's test this now. Now you can see that the styling that we just set applies to the post element in the full screen view. Now you may notice that the button is no longer visible here, and that's because the button exists outside of the post element, but we can bring that in the JavaScript by appending the button to the post element when it's in the full screen view, and then when exiting full screen, append the button to the body where it is originally. So appending the toggle element like this, it won't duplicate the existence of it, it will just shift it around in the DOM. So that's the behavior that we want, and we can make the CSS a little bit more efficient here. So this styling that we have here, we could make this apply to the body and any element that has the isFullScreen class, and then delete from here any styling that is included previously, and then leave in here any styling that I want to apply to the isFullScreen element specifically. So this is more efficient if you want the styling of the isFullScreen element to reflect the styling of the body. So let's test this now. To full screen, we now have the toggler button in this view, and the styling for this post element that is in full screen view is being shared now with the body. Now finally, for some best practices when you're using the Fullscreen API, the first is to check whether going full screen is available to a user. So you can do that by checking the value of the full screen enabled property. If it's true, then it's possible to go full screen. If not, then you probably want to remove the full screen toggle button from the DOM or make it non-visible. I will remove it here because this can occur because a user is using an old version of a browser. I'm going to use a more backwards compatible solution for removing the toggler from the DOM and calling the remove method. So I'm going to the parent node, and then removing the child, which is toggler, and afterwards, to prevent any of the subsequent code running, it's a good idea to throw an error. So I'll write an appropriate error message in here. So if we run this code as it is, nothing's changed because the value of full screen enabled is true and the code in the if statement won't run. But if that's not the case, just to test it, we get this error message and the error prevents the rest of the code from running. So I'll just change that back. The second best practice that I want to show you is how you can make this solution more backwards compatible, because early implementations of the Fullscreen API used prefixes in certain browsers. So instead of, for example, accessing the property Fullscreen enabled, you would be accessing MS or Moz or WebKit Fullscreen enabled, depending on the browser. So what you need to do to make this solution compatible with these early implementations is, instead of accessing, for example, Fullscreen enabled, getting that from a function which checks whether Fullscreen enabled is available, if not, checking if a prefix is available, and then also doing this for all other instances of interacting with the Fullscreen API. So rather than writing out those functions in this tutorial, I'm just going to paste some in that I prepared and talk through them instead, because otherwise it will be quite repetitive. So for the first one, instead of checking the value of document Fullscreen enabled, I'm checking to see if this is true or if any of the extensions are true, and returning that. For the function exit Fullscreen, I'm checking to see if the exit Fullscreen function exists and returning that. If it does, if it doesn't, then I'm checking for each of the prefixes the same pattern for request Fullscreen. And for Fullscreen element, I'm checking first for Fullscreen element on document, returning that if it exists. If not, then I'm checking the prefixes. Now, in earlier implementations of the Fullscreen API, the event that we were listening out for, it also had a different name dependent upon the browser. So I'll paste in the solution for that here. So what I'm doing is checking if the Fullscreen API is available without a prefix. If it is, then listening out for the Fullscreen change event like we were doing, and then firing an update function in response. If not, checking the prefixes and listening out for the event associated with each browser. Now, instead of listening out for the Fullscreen change event here, instead we just convert this to a function that will be called by one of the event listeners above. Now, the last changes that we need to make to the code to make it prefix friendly is, every time we're using the Fullscreen API, don't use it directly, rely upon our functions. So here, instead of getting the value of Fullscreen element, I would rely upon the return value of calling own Fullscreen element. And I need to change the other instances where I'm interacting with the Fullscreen API. So here I would rely upon the return value of my function own Fullscreen enabled. For Fullscreen element here, I rely upon the return value of the function own Fullscreen element. For exit Fullscreen, I just call own exit Fullscreen, and that's going to exit Fullscreen inside the function. And finally, for request Fullscreen, so for this one, I created the request Fullscreen function that accepts an argument, and that is the element on which request Fullscreen is called. So if we take a look at the function definition here, that it calls request Fullscreen on whatever element that you pass into it, or the prefix equivalent if the browser supports a prefix and not the main one. But when you're making code backwards compatible, it's not only prefixes that you have to worry about, it's about using any kind of modern code that may not be understood by an older browser version. So what I'm going to do is paste the code into the online Barbel transpiler. So this transpiles whatever code you put into it with modern features into code that is compatible with a target that you specify. So I'm asking Barbel to target Internet Explorer 11, and you can see here older syntax features than I was using. So you'd usually run this through Webpack, but in this example, I'm just using the online code editor, just purely for speed. So I'm going to paste this transpile code. So if we test this in my modern version of Chrome, there's no difference to how it was functioning before. Now, if I try it in Internet Explorer, that only accesses the Fullscreen API through prefixes. So I can prove that to you. If I try logging to the console here, Fullscreen element, you see that all that comes up are these prefixed versions. But with our code as it is at the moment, supporting prefixes, we can still go full screen in Internet Explorer as well. So that is it for this tutorial on how you can go full screen using JavaScript, either for the full page or an element on it, and also how you can make the solution more backwards compatible by supporting prefixes. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, please consider hitting the like button down below this video. It helps us with the algorithm and others to find this video. And if you'd like to see more content like this from us in the future, don't forget you can subscribe to the channel.